as newly obtained data show the accumulation of spike proteins in reproductive organs. Now, this was a major concern months ago. Many immunologists and virologists and vaccine experts and doctors and scientists all came out and expressed this concern of these spike proteins accumulating in parts of the body, in regions of the body with high concentration of ACE2 receptors. This was a concern for a while. A lot of these doctors and scientists and vaccine experts were banned from social media. Their videos banned from YouTube for expressing this concern, which social media and the mainstream media considered to be a debunked conspiracy theory. Much like the debunked conspiracy theory of the lab leak origin, which they all claim to be debunked. And this was spread by President Trump, which is now basically widely acceptable across the mainstream media as of today. And they say that this could potentially be the actual origin of the virus, just like the debunked conspiracy theories about the surface spread and the mask efficacy and all the rest. They're all coming out point by point by point and admitting that we were basically correct. But now, of course, this is still considered to be a conspiracy theory. And if you talk about this on mainstream social media platforms, you will likely be banned from those mainstream social media platforms. But now we have vaccine experts coming out and saying that, yeah, this is a concern and this is probably a reality based on newly obtained data from a Freedom of Information Act request. So we're going to go through this story. This should be a bombshell news story. This should be in the Washington Post, the New York Times, on CNN, on MSNBC, and all the rest, if they were honest journalists, but we know that they're not, especially with the recent lab leak story. They're all rushing to stealth edit their articles to basically make it seem that they never claimed that this was a debunked conspiracy theory. Some outlets are even taking down YouTube clips from YouTube, different news segments that they have done, claiming that this was a debunked conspiracy theory and that this is not a possibility whatsoever. This shows you that they're not honest at all. But we're going to go through the story. This is a bombshell news story. I also want to talk about the vaccine passport ban in Florida. Apparently, it doesn't do at all what they said that it actually does. So we'll go through all of that. Before we get started, I just want to remind you to check out the links in the description below and go over to either preparewithvincent.com or waterwithvincent.com. We get a substantial portion of every order from this website. It helps me out. It helps you out. At preparewithvincent.com, you can get $100 off a 4-week emergency dry food supplies. Dry food supplies, a 25-year shelf life. This 4-week supply is actually cheaper than 4 weeks of food at your local grocery store. In fact, if you get the 3-month supply, it's actually cheaper per week. $20 cheaper per week than the 4-week supply, so you can check that out. Like I said, we get a big portion of every order from these websites. If you go to waterwithvincent.com, you can get a portable water filter. Lexapure Pro water filtration system filters up to 5,000 gallons of water, removes 200-plus contaminants, including fluoride, viruses, bacteria, pesticides, and pharmaceuticals. And especially with the whole new pandemic of cyber attacks that's happening now on meat packing plants and gas and all the rest, you definitely want to have your food supply just in case for you and your family. Okay, so let's dig into the news here. I want to dig into this first story here. This is up on dailyveracity.com, and it says, immunologists say the mRNA vaccine is a big mistake as new data show accumulation in reproductive organs. Viral immunologist Dr. Byram Brittle is sounding the alarm in the medical community about newly obtained data showing the accumulation of spike proteins in organs caused by the Moderna and Pfizer mRNA vaccines. mRNA uses the cell's machinery to synthesize proteins that are supposed to resemble the spike protein of the coronavirus, which is what the virus uses to enter the ACE2 receptor. These proteins are then identified by the immune system, which builds antibodies against them. The concern many experts had is that these proteins could accumulate in the body, especially in the regions of high concentration of ACE2 receptors, like the testicles and the ovaries. According to newly obtained research, these concerns appear to be a reality. And by the way, I just want to mention this one more time. You know, this has been talked about for a long time. They have been talking about this for a very long time. Many experts have been talking about this potentially being a concern. And the reason why we're seeing these blood clotting disorders and all the rest, but of course they were brushed off as conspiracy theories, even though this was coming from a broad variety of experts. If you look back at the Great Barrington Declaration and some other things that were written about this, they all mentioned this being a concern, but they were all banned from social media for mentioning this. Even the experts, which they say that we should trust, were banned from social media for mentioning this. They had their Twitter accounts deactivated in a lot of cases. It goes on, it says, Dr. Bridle and a group of international scientists filed a request for information from the accumulation on the accumulation concern from the Japanese regulatory agency and received access to what's called the biodistribution study. Quote, until now, we're assuming that these were acting like traditional vaccines, where they go in the shoulder muscle and they don't go anywhere else. By the way, they're not like traditional vaccines. This is mRNA, which is completely different, never before tried on humans ever. We are the test trials right now, and that's a fact. However, this data shows us that this is more than 3/4 of the dose, that more than 3/4 of the dose is no longer present at the injection site in the shoulder. It turns out that these are traveling all throughout the body, Bridle said on a conference call, showing accumulation in many organs, including in the ovaries. I'm going to play a clip right now. This is the Zoom meeting they had.
A legitimate request through the Freedom of Information Act. A confidential report submitted by Pfizer was obtained from the Japanese regulatory agency. And so I just want to show people, this is a real document. This is data from their study that shows where their vaccine platform, right? So again, I said this, what these are is these messenger RNAs. They're coated in these sort of little fat bubbles. We call them lipid nanoparticles. And so they looked where these go in the body. So until now, we were assuming that these are acting like traditional vaccines, where they go in the shoulder muscle and they don't go anywhere else. However, what this data shows us, and hold the table, people are free to take a screenshot of this if they want, but it is available on your site, right? If they want to take a screenshot, I just want to show there's the numbers. And what this table tells us is where these lipid nanoparticles are going after injection. And remarkably, at most time points, after more than 3/4 of the dose is no longer present at the injection site in the shoulder. So you ask, where is it going? Well, it turns out that these are traveling all throughout the body into all kinds of tissues. So I'm just going to highlight one here. I just want to show to people this. So if you look here, for example, what I'm pointing at here, and people might be able to see it, but is ovaries. And if you follow the numbers along, if you can do that, what you'll see is an increase over time. So they start looking at 15 minutes and went up to 48 hours, and it continues to increase. So it's accumulating in the ovaries, for example. And if people look at this table, they'll see it accumulates elsewhere. So our concern is that this raises, a legitimate question. We're not saying, and I'm not saying that this means there's going to be any damage to the ovaries, for example. What it does, though, is it tells us that if we're getting the spike protein, for example, expressed in these tissues, there is logical, scientific reasons why that could potentially be harmful. And as a consequence, we feel this is the type of study that should have been done before these vaccines were rolled out.
So, obviously, if you think about the spike proteins accumulating in places like the ovaries and the testicles and other organs throughout the body, especially in regions with a high concentration of ACE2 receptors, then obviously the logical conclusion would be that the body is going to attack that particular area of the body, which could cause damage. And so, like he said, this is a study that should have been done prior to the release of these vaccines, which were rushed through, by the way. I don't know if anyone realizes this, but within months, we had these vaccines and we were injecting them into people's arms. A lot of the trials were combined, were reduced, were skipped entirely, a lot of the phase trials. And basically what's going on now is this vaccine being administered into the human population is the trial, is the testing that is being done to finally get full biological licensing and approval from the FDA, which is not even completely done yet. So they need to complete the phase 3 trials of human testing to be able to apply for biological licensing and approval from the FDA, which is probably going to come toward the end of June when they apply for this. This is not even fully approved by the FDA, but yet here we are. And this stuff has been out for a while, for months, actually. This concern has been expressed for months, like I've said, but it was completely ignored and banned from social media. They did not have a seat at the table to discuss this, which is what is supposed to happen in science. Anyway, it goes on. It says the new research shows that the coronavirus spike protein from COVID-19 vaccination unexpectedly enters the bloodstream, which is a plausible explanation for the tens of thousands of reported blood clots, as well as brain and reproductive damage, the Canadian cancer vaccine researcher said last week. Now, when we talk about tens of thousands of cases, adverse events, it's more than that. If you go to VAERS, so for instance, I'll bring back to the article here. If you go to the latest VAERS data, which shows 5,100 deaths reported following COVID-19 vaccines, VAERS is the CDC's primary mechanism in the U.S. for reporting adverse vaccine reactions, and it is historically, according to a Harvard study, historically only reports about 1% of the actual adverse events. So on VAERS, it's usually the healthcare professional, the primary care physician, what have you, that is going to report to VAERS. It's not any, single everyday person that's going to report the VAERS. It's your healthcare professional that's going to report the VAERS. And traditionally, historically, according to a Harvard study, only 1% of actual adverse events are actually reported to the VAERS system. So it's a flawed system, but right now it's reporting hundreds of thousands of adverse events from the vaccines, 5,000 deaths. Now, if you just take that and apply 1% to that, you can imagine why there might potentially be millions of adverse events that are happening from these vaccines, especially with this particular concern in mind. But of course, this is something that's not being talked about. We also have the whole heart inflammation thing in children that's happening. It says the newest data show that between December 14, 2020 and May 28th, a total of 294,801 total adverse events were reported to VAERS, including 5,165 deaths, an increase of 7,759 over the previous week. There were 25,359 serious injuries reported, up to 3,822 compared with last week. Among 12 to 17-year-olds, there were 40 reports of heart inflammation and 16 cases of blood clotting disorders. An article on 7 U.S. teen boys in several states published on Friday in Pediatrics is among the latest report of heart inflammation discovered after COVID-19 vaccination. We have this news clip here of this boy who was suffering from heart inflammation. He survived. Luckily, you can watch that video up at dailyveracity.com. We have death reports in VAERS. This is May 28, 2021. You can see that big jump there. We can also look at natural immunity over immunity from the vaccines. And this is something I've talked about for a while now. This is something that I was recently proven right on, according to the New York Times report that came out, which we've known for a long time, which is that, listen, if you have a less than 1% chance of dying from COVID, which is probably even way less than we originally imagined, considering the fact that now they're just starting to come around and admit that, the death toll is probably heavily inflated. In fact, there was one county in California that reported that is now reducing their death toll in this specific county. I think it's Alameda County. They said that their death total was 25% inflated, so now they're reducing it down by 25%. There are studies out there that suggest that it could be a lot higher nationally as far as the amount of people who have actually died from COVID. So what Alameda County said was that the people who were registered as dying from COVID didn't actually die from COVID. They died from something else, but they had COVID. And this is something that was considered to be a conspiracy theory for a long time as well, which is that the COVID death toll was inflated. But coroners have come out, medical examiners have come out and said that, listen, these people are dying of gunshot wounds and car accidents, but because they have COVID, they're being listed as COVID deaths. We have quotes from coroners, quotes from medical examiners themselves who are coming out and talking about this, who too are banned from social media for even speaking about this. And so if you have a very tiny, minuscule chance of being even hospitalized from COVID-19, but you also have a tiny chance, like a less than 1% chance of dying from getting the vaccine, and an even higher chance of having an adverse event after getting the vaccine, why wouldn't you choose natural immunity, which seems to be better immunity anyway, over the immunity that is given supposedly by the vaccine? And this was something else that was mentioned during a Zoom meeting with viral immunologist Dr. Byron Brittle, where another expert went on to talk about why the quality of natural immunity is likely better than the immunity received from the mRNA vaccines. A recent report by the New York Times showed that people who have been naturally infected with coronavirus have natural immunity that will likely last for years and maybe forever. Well, that's what herd immunity is. Once a virus comes and affects the human population, as you get it, the effects are going to be less and less and less and less. But here's this clip from the Zoom call now.
There already is some immunity. People that have recovered, my friends, you have immunity. And it, in our professional opinion, at least as good as that for the vaccine. And Stephen pointed out why that is, because when you see the whole virus, you get to see all parts. And what he didn't mention is in South Vancouver, and this is a published paper that you can look up. He's one of the authors. 90%, 90, he always reminds me, it's 90, had antibodies already to this virus. That shows there's immunity. And now, what do we do now? Well, we should be testing. Why haven't we been testing people to look at what antibodies they have? We realize antibody is not the perfect test, but it is a good indicator. We also have tests now to detect T cells, T-Detect. So there are also, the other piece of good news is there are tests out there